do that, and then we can kind of go into a mini lesson. I always like to come prepared with something that I might give my students, because obviously modeling is a great teaching technique. And so for people who are learning to be teachers, I think that's pretty important. So I went to John Jay High School and then came back 4 years later after getting my bachelor's at Marist for history and fiction. So, you know, all my professors were always like, oh, you might have to teach economics, but probably not. It's fine. Don't worry about it. And I think Marist only required one economics course, so I took macroeconomics. And I did well and I enjoyed it, but I was like, oh God, I hope I never have to teach this. And yet I get hired to teach 9th grade global and economics. I'm like, well, okay, here we go. And so a lot of it was teaching myself, which in general, your first year in education, you're going to be teaching yourself, even if it's things that you've taken, you know, extensive courses in. You forget things over time. You have to teach yourself how to boil it down to what high schoolers can understand and will pay attention to. But when it comes to economics, so many people really don't have a very good grasp on what economics is. They think they understand supply and demand, but they really don't. So that's kind of what we're going to focus on today in our little mini lesson, is supply and demand. Before I continue, when was the last time any of you took an economics class? How many of you was it when you were in high school? Just give me like a thumbs up hand. Okay. How many of you took it in the last year? 2 years? Nothing. 1 year? Okay. So, all right. So that tends to be kind of the case, right? It's astounding to me that when you're looking at something that is so essential to our livelihood, like the economy, and yet we spend so little time on it. And that's part of why I really enjoy teaching it. You know, so like I said, I was dreading going in to teach the economics. It was the part that I was most terrified about. And it actually is the course that I love teaching the most. In my second year of teaching, they were like, hey, you're taking the AP economics now too. And I was like, oh Lord, this is like a whole nother world, because now you're talking more math, more graphing. And again, reteaching myself, because of course I was teaching micro, which I didn't take in college, and I did take the macro. So again, even that, it was scary, but I ended up loving it because it's so relatable to the world, to our lives. I mean, even in the midst of this pandemic, right? How quickly did you hear people start talking about the economy and how it was going to change things, and talking about recessions, talking about supply chain failure, all this sort of stuff that you're thinking, oh, like people are getting sick. And that is obviously the most important part of the whole pandemic. But then in the background, and yet completely in people's faces, for those who've lost jobs, for those who are trying to afford their homes, it is, for many people, the most immediate pressing matter to them. So, you know, when it comes to economics, the best thing you can do is pull from current events to try and give examples for all of these very like theoretical things that you're talking about. And so that's sort of my general advice. And really, you know, I know colleges these days are sort of anti-textbook, but my next big piece of advice, aside from going to current events, is actually start with the textbook first, right? Start with the concrete information. Even if you don't give the kids the textbook, it's okay for you to get your basis from a textbook, because your first couple of years, you're going to be swamped. People are going to be throwing so much at you that the best way to know how to narrow it down is someone's already done it. So use that book to kind of at least guide you, and then you can pull more resources from that. All right, again, before I start rambling, are there any questions, any concerns you have just in general, whether it's about teaching, economics, the transition from a history teacher to economics? Okay, if at any point, just like throw something in the chat, and if not, then that's cool. So I did prepare like a mini lesson. John, how do they get the worksheet, or should I just pull it up and present?
You can pull it up, present. They also have it under course readings.
Okay.
It should be there for this session, session 6, and it's a Word document. So you all can pull it up on your screen, which I think everyone is able to do.
Okay.
Yeah.
And
you can share.
I've never presented in Zoom before. This is going to be intriguing.
Yeah, it's a little different than Google Classroom. I think it's like a share screen you can do.
Okay, so share screen and then share computer sound. Are they still going to get my voice even while that's happening?
Yeah, it should be.
Should be? Okay. because there is a video to watch too.
Yeah. We only switched to Zoom for this class, so if it's a learning process, right? We're all learners.
Yeah, it's it's always new. Let's see, where did I open this up? Here we go. Okay, so can you all see my screen and have the thing in front of you?
Yeah, we can see it. Yep.
Great. So this is a sample that, it could be something that you use in class. It could be something that you do as a homework assignment. It probably will not take a full 45-minute session. This I would expect to be maybe a half hour's worth of work. But when you bring in the discussion factor and the going over it, it could potentially be, an entire period, depending on how many questions the kids have, how into it they are. And so normally I would over plan. Along with this, I probably would have done like a do now, like a starter on supply and demand, and asking kids, what questions they have. So we'll kind of come back around to that after we sort of go through this reading. So, I just literally Googled supply and demand during COVID, and this is one of the articles that I came up with. Of course, I didn't put the source on here. I think it was CNBC, if I'm correct. So we're looking at, feeding strawberries to cows, farmers forced to throw fruit and flowers, I assume it should say away, as coronavirus disrupts supplies. So again, it could be something you give the students and say, hey, read this, answer the questions, and then we'll go over it. It could be something that you read along with them. And I know that sounds ridiculous to say that you're going to be reading along with juniors and seniors. And yet, honestly, some of them need it. Some of them like it. It also lets you pause and do discussion, which is something that I'm sort of big on. So I'm going to do that with you. I'm going to read it to you just for the sake of, because I can't see, all of your faces and it's awkward teaching on Zoom. So farmers all over the world are letting their crops rot in the fields as the coronavirus pandemic disrupts supply and demand for a wide variety of perishable goods, including flowers, fruit, and milk. Some have resorted to creative ways to get rid of supplies they are stuck with, such as feeding strawberries to cows. Honestly, it sounds healthier than what they normally feed to cows, right? The United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization flagged the risks of a food crisis due to the pandemic earlier this year. It is now playing out globally due to widespread lockdown and movement restrictions to contain the spread of COVID-19. So something that I might pause in class and suggest to my students is that phrasing movement restrictions is really referring to what we would call the supply chain, right? How the goods get from the farm to your table. And, unfortunately in our system, or in some ways fortunately, because it gives us greater variety, but there's usually a lot of steps between your food and your plate, okay? Because a lot of things don't get grown in the United States. Even if they are, they might be grown across the entire country. And that's part of why, fruits and vegetables aren't as fresh. They don't taste as flavorful because they pick them before they're ripe. You can go into a whole discussion about that process, with the students, and the changing over to more local farms like CSAs and all those sorts of things that are opening up now. Or you could just keep going through, it's kind of up to you how you'd want to teach it. So continuing, the lockdowns that we are all experiencing across the globe are causing a disruption of labor. So we are not getting people into the field to produce on farms. Also, it's a disruption of worldwide transport and supply chains. And so there's that term supply chains popping up. That is causing this unusual phenomenon of shortages in some areas and excess in others, said Michael Strano, a lead principal investigator for disruptive and sustainable technology in agriculture at the Singapore MIT Alliance for Research and Technology. Even though production levels have generally been healthy, harvests have been affected due to the lockdowns, as many workers can't get to the farms to work or are unable to transport the produce. So when adjusting to new norms, there are no real threats as much as supply chain adjustments and certainly no shortage of food, said Gary Weber, Senior Director for Food Safety and Contamination Prevention at A World Aware, a risk management company. Reports of empty shelves are due to hoarding, shifts in eating patterns from restaurants to the home, students being at home during the day and eating lunches previously consumed at schools, and some supply chain adjustments that are underway, Weber told CNBC in an email. It comes as food banks in the US report shortages of staple food, even as the coronavirus hit economy triggers a spike in the number of people needing help. And so here I would likely pause and sort of have a discussion about what they've been watching on TV. And I know kids don't necessarily watch TV, they watch Netflix, but they're stuck at home with their parents, so they might actually be watching TV now. And, you know, even things like, I don't know if you're a Parks and Rec fan, but I am. And so I was very excited when they had their little reunion and the money they were raising was going towards Feeding America. I don't know if you're a golf fan. I am. And I watched Tiger Woods and Peyton Manning play and Tom Brady. And who the heck was he with? Phil Mickelson. So I watched them and they were donating towards another charity. And so again, it's a way where when you're reading it with them, you get to bring in more of that like real world outside information and ask them questions, right? So what have you seen that has been helping to try and restore food banks and bring food to those who were already hurting pre-pandemic and now, you know, their supplies are even shorter than they were before. So, you know, again, it's sort of up to you. I don't read to them every single time, but it's something that with things like this, I kind of like to bring that humanity aspect into it. So continuing the reading, with more people cooking at home, supply chains need to shift from catering to restaurants to catering to grocery stores, but they have different requirements in terms of packaging and specific cuts in the case of meat. This also means that sellers need to have the equipment in place to package the food for consumers, and many don't. In the case of milk, dairy farmers in the US have been forced to dump them due to a reduction in demand. School lunch programs purchase a lot of milk, cheese, and butter and other products, noted Weber. And so side note, Mr. Shakika had posted something about milk being dumped, right? I think early on in the pandemic. Yeah, and I was like, cheese. Yeah. It's like, just make cheese.
Yeah.
Which sounds really easy, except for milk farmers don't necessarily have the production equipment for producing cheese, right? Or the space in which to store it. And so things that seem simple are not necessarily so. So using any excess milk to make cheese and other dairy products will also require adjustments to the process and storage space. The supply chain is adjusting to the new normal. Specifically, there is a supply chain that caters to schools, restaurants, cafeterias, etc., and another that caters to grocery stores, said Hitendra Chaturvedi, a supply chain expert and professor at Arizona State University. U.S. spending on food away from home accounted for 54.4% of total food expenditures in 2018, according to the U.S. Department of Agriculture. So one thing that you do want to keep in mind with that statistic, right? And remember, statistics are never perfect. They are, you know, skewable, if that's a word. And I had actually been listening to a podcast from Freakonomics, which is a great resource to use. And they were saying that while, yes, the purchasing food away from home accounts for 54.4%, remember that they jack up prices on food that you're purchasing from a restaurant because you're paying for people to cook that food and to prepare it. And so even though that's the case, you're really only getting maybe 30 to 40% of your actual food consumption with that amount of money that you're spending. And so again, here's another way to sort of bring in key details, or maybe that's their homework, right? Is say, hey, go listen to this chunk of this podcast because it's a 45-minute podcast. They may not be able to listen to the whole thing. So at least go listen to this chunk and explain how it relates to this worksheet. Continuing. So with COVID-19 closing schools and cafeterias, that supply chain is transitioning to start producing products to suit a grocery store, and that takes time, Chaturvedi added to NBC in an email. Fruit and flowers are also tossed. It's not just food that's being discarded. Perishable items like flowers are also being thrown away as demand dries up globally. And in the Netherlands, growers have been forced to compost flowers due to a plunge in demand for the blooms as many events have been canceled. And so the Netherlands accounts for about 80% of the world's flower bulb production. Now, I don't know how that will impact next year, right? I don't know if they had to get rid of like the literal bulbs or if they were able to save them, but you could in the future see then a huge rise in prices for flowers because of this having to throw so much away this year. We'll have to see how that works. And so according to the trade cooperative Royal Floral Holland, which runs the world's largest floral auctions, prices were 22% lower than a year ago at last week's flower and plant auctions. Fruit growers in various parts of the world from the US to Southeast Asia also have supplies that they are unable to move due to movement restrictions, keeping workers and customers away. Some places are trying to shore up local demand to consume the products that would otherwise be left to waste. Belgians are being called upon to eat fries at least twice a week, as more than 750,000 tons of potatoes are at risk of being thrown away. I will help them gladly. Like, that sounds like a great problem to have, but hopefully Belgians like fries, I don't know. In India, some farmers are feeding strawberries normally meant for tourist consumption and ice cream producers to cows, Reuters reported. In the Netherlands, companies have stepped up to buy blooms so as to give them away to employees or others. And although suppliers know they need to readjust their business and supply chains, the uncertainty has made it hard to make business plans. And that's perhaps the biggest impact that you'll see moving forward, is that businesses normally have a projection for how much they're going to sell. But because they're uncertain as to how quickly, the states are going to actually lift restrictions, and then more importantly, how quickly people are going to be willing to go to stores, to go to restaurants, to buy, extraneous items like flowers, that they may have a hard time making projections. And that could mean that they end up with shortages, which means rising prices. It could mean that they are over optimistic and have excess and you see prices fall for things. A lot remains to be seen, especially when, we have to look at what the global economy does, as we're so interconnected these days. So although suppliers know they need to readjust their business and supply chains, the uncertainty has made it hard to make those business plans. If producers knew that schools and offices would not reopen across the board, they would rejig their entire supply chain and send them to grocery stores, and all the shortages would be over, said Chaturvedi, but they do not know the answer yet. So the questions I ask are usually fairly straightforward, but a lot of times I will include graphing, because graphing is, I think, very important to understanding the concept of supply and demand, but it's also something that can actually be tested on, right? So depending on what you're dealing with, like my AP students, graphing is usually so essential to their exam, aside from this year with the whole crazy online testing format. So let's look at just some of the questions that I asked. So what disruptions are caused by the COVID lockdowns? So I'm looking for answers like, changes in the supply chain, people that normally sell wholesale now have to sell to groceries, things along those lines. According to Gary Weber, there was no shortage of food, so why were the shelves empty? And that was at the beginning of the article, and talking about the fact that they just can't get workers, right? Because people are either choosing to stay home, they're not able to commute to work, or the government has said you have to stay home, and so that's part of it. Now, question 3 is the graphing of the supply and demand for milk, and illustrate how prices and quantities change based on the article. So here's where I'm going to pause, and I'm going to have you guys take 2 minutes, see if you can remember anything about supply and demand and what it looks like. And let's just look back at what we're talking about here with milk. So in the case of milk, dairy farmers in the US have been forced to dump them due to a reduction in demand. So there's 2 things that you're actually wanting to graph here. So one is first a decrease in demand, and the second is then a decrease in supply. So take 2 minutes, see if you can figure out what that graph should look like, even if you just get to the starting point of supply and demand. And then I'm gonna unshare the screen, and actually I've got my little whiteboard over here. Do you guys have any questions before I let you take a chance at that?
Once again, where is the link for this?
Sorry, Nick. It's under, so if you go under the Blackboard page and you go to course readings, it should be under session 6.
Okay, sorry about that. Thank you.
Yeah, no worries. Good question. It's on Blackboard.
Take another like 30 seconds. Okay, so first off, and you can go ahead and unmute, does anybody know what my two axes need to be labeled? Because that's a pretty important part of this whole thing.
Would it just be supply and demand?
It is not. That's what most people end up thinking, but that's okay, right? This is why we're doing it, because that's part of why I asked when the last time you guys
Oh, is it price and quantity?
Yes, yeah, good. So that's where, you know, it's been a long time for most of you. And so I honestly didn't expect anybody would get it. So that's awesome. Nice. And think about just the reasoning behind that, right? If you're talking about the demand for something, you have to think about, well, part of how I make my decision on how much to buy, so that's the quantity, right, is based on the price of it. You know, if you're going to Dunkin', let's say, because I'm craving my Dunkin', and you want to go and get yourself a coffee, it's going to, for my, you know, coconut, almond milk, iced, whatever, it's going to cost me like $2.34. Probably just going to buy one of them. However, let's say they're having a 2-for-1 deal that day. So really, each coffee costs me $1.15. Well, I might buy myself one and then buy, you know, my office mate a coffee as well. And so that price change is going to alter how many coffees I'm willing to buy. On a regular day, though, screw her. She can get her own damn coffee at $2.34 a cup, right? So when it comes to the seller of things, they also need to consider, well, how much am I going to charge for every single item that I sell? Because if I can sell a lot of something, and this is where it's kind of counterintuitive, I'm going to actually want to charge a higher price. Or really the reverse is how they're thinking. The higher the price, the more of something that I'm willing to produce. Because if I can sell this pen for $1, I might sell 100 of them, make $100. But if I could sell this pen for $10, I'll make 1,000 of these babies. Why the hell not, right? That's a ton of money. And so when you're telling the kids, or when you're thinking about the supplier, you kind of want to think about them as being selfish. And I'm not trying to make commentary on businesses, but think about it as they're self-interested, right? They want to make as much as possible by selling as much as possible at the highest price possible. And so who knows then what direction my supply curve should be going? Should it be sloping upward or downward? Upward, good. I saw that hand signal. So your supply curve is going to be upward sloping. And then you as the consumer, you want to get as much for as little as possible. And so there's an inverse relationship then between supply and demand. And that's what creates our nice little equilibrium point. And so something that I try and drill into the kids' heads is go ahead and actually illustrate the equilibrium. If you have your starting point, this is telling you that this is the price. So let's round my Dunkin' coffee down to $2, all right? And I'm gonna buy one of them, right? If that were Dunkin' coffee that we're talking about. But we're graphing milk. So actually, honestly, that still works for milk. Like I could probably get, you know, a half gallon of milk, which is really all I need for a week. And I'm gonna buy 1 carton of it. So we'll stick with those numbers because for some people, numbers help them see it better than just like P1, P2, Q1, Q2, all that nonsense. So the first thing that we saw then with the milk during this COVID situation is that there was a decrease in demand. And so if that's happening, it's not talking about a decrease in the quantity that you're demanding because price has nothing to do with this situation. It's just the fact that restaurants aren't buying milk. Schools aren't buying milk. My God, schools are like one of the biggest consumers of milk products out there, right? So all of a sudden, there's a decrease in the demand. I'm just going to label it D2, that people are willing to purchase. And across the board, right? Households themselves probably were actually buying more milk because their kids are home, but it doesn't outweigh what's being purchased by restaurants and schools. And so what that does is, oh, these numbers were bad. Let's say in general it was 10 because we're talking schools or something. What that's going to do, it's going to decrease the quantity that is willing to be purchased, maybe down to 8. And it's also going to decrease the price. So let's say it brings us down to $1.50. Now, when businesses are seeing this, they're like, oh my God, people are buying less quantity than they were before, but I have just as many cows as I had before, right? They don't necessarily want to go killing off their cattle because that's going to ruin their production for down the line. So what's their only option? I mean, aside from making cheese, but for most of them, that's not an option, right? Their option is to dump that milk out, in which case they're going to see a decrease then in the supply of milk. And again, this isn't just about the price of milk falling. That's part of it. But if that were the case, you would just see it sliding along the curve like it has here, right? There was a change in the quantity being supplied, but you can't stop cows from producing milk. And so what they have to do is decrease the supply by dumping it out. And this is something that was done during the Great Depression, right? I mean, you had literally 25 to 30% of the population unemployed. And rather than giving people free milk, which would have caused prices to plummet further and would have hurt farmers more, the government said, hey, just dump out your milk. And I mean, hundreds of millions of gallons of milk were dumped. And so something very similar here. And now look what that's done. It's brought us to a lower quantity, because you want to make sure you're looking at S2 and D2 now. But we're now back to the $2 range. So by reducing how much supply of milk there is out there, it lowers how much is available to be purchased by people, and it raises that price back up. And so that was the goal, right? That's part of why farmers wanted to do this. Number one, they couldn't let the milk spoil. And number two, it actually helps them by raising that price back up. Okay? Does that make sense? Do you have any questions? All right, is this coming back to you, hopefully? A little bit? Good. So this is something where when I'm starting to teach this with my students, I usually do not do 2 shifts in one shot, right? Because it just makes it so much more confusing when both supply and demand are shifting. It was much simpler when just one of them shifted. And in fact, when I start teaching supply and demand, I don't even start with them together. I start with just the supply curve. Actually, I start with just the demand curve first, because kids understand demand better because they demand things all the time. And then I shift over, I explain the supply curve. And then once they really kind of get how they work, I can bring them back into one concept and do something like this. So this would probably be something that I'm not touching until I'm into week 3 or 4 in my economics course in a half-year semester. Because I've taken about 3 or 4 days on demand, 3 or 4 days on supply. I do another 3 and 4 days with them combined. Okay. And usually that's after we've done just basics of like what an economy is and sort of things like that. You're going to have kids that don't get this. Plain and simple. You've got kids that suck at math. You've got kids that hate graphing. But if you can at least get them to understand it by bringing that real world connection in, whether you're talking about coffee or milk or something like that, and you can show them a real world situation like that article. Again, some kids hate articles, whatever. Some kids hate everything. You're going to have to deal with it somehow. But the more real connections you can make to their livelihoods, the better off you are. All right, questions or comments before I continue on with my little lesson? Okay, and so again, you can see how you can take this and you can turn it into a full period lesson just by doing the stopping and talking, the asking questions, do a little bit of recall with them. You might even want to just do a quick refresher on supply separately and demand separately before you even started the reading, something along those lines. All right, so if we go back to the worksheet, I've got a video because I'm a huge fan of, aside from articles, which are good and you want kids to read, but you definitely also want kids to be able to watch videos and pull from them, because they love videos because they think they're not working when they watch videos, but you have to teach them how to pull information from them. And that's where questioning comes in handy. They're going to groan about the fact that you put questions on a sheet. They can't just sit there and watch it, but that's okay, because they just have to get used to it. And actually before that, I've got a couple more questions, right? What did Netherlands destroy? Flowers. Belgium, you know, they want people eating fries. And then for question 6, and this is where it goes beyond just the article. So before I get to that other video, I asked them, like, what have you had difficulty finding, right? Did your parents come home and complain about not being able to get toilet paper? All right, let me tell you, when I couldn't get my brand of toilet paper, I was a cranky lady, especially because I literally just bought like a huge, you know, thing from BJ's before the pandemic. So it lasted me like a month. I'm like, oh, I'll be fine. A month in, the toilet paper's got to be back. Nope, it definitely was not. So, you know, things like that, you know, you might think the kids are disconnected from their parents, but they're not. They listen, they hear. And especially with juniors and seniors who now probably have jobs, cars, and are buying things themselves, they'll definitely notice things changing in price and maybe even not becoming more expensive. But look at gas, right? These kids are probably loving it. The ones that just got their license and all of a sudden it drops from like $2.70 a gallon to $2.10. Hell, I love it. And I'm not even driving anywhere. I was like, I'm going to fill up my car just because. Why not? You know, let's do it. And so they'll be able to pull in some good discussion with that. So, okay, so the second thing is kind of related to some of the topics they were talking about in the article, but it's just like a 5-minute video. So we're going to watch it again. You know, I just Googled for videos and supply and demand during COVID. And this came up. And, you know, again, you want to get some legitimate sources. Don't just find some random dude's like blog. But, you know, there's different places that you can go. You know, it doesn't have to be just New York Times or Wall Street Journal. There are other really good sources out there. So once this comes up, you can check it out. And if you want to follow the questions along with the video, if you're able to, if not, we'll go back to them at the end. Oh, my computer's so slow. Come on.
Everyone seems to be baking
Hello. There we go.
these days. But finding key ingredients like flour isn't always easy, leaving many consumers wondering if...
Oh, hold on. There we go. Oh, it does not like zooming and playing videos. Let's see.
It can be done theoretically, but
I mean, my computer, my laptop.
Coronavirus pandemic
so
has caused a flour shortage.
I'm going to try to open it up and see if I can
But
do it.
flour producers are saying something else.
Do you want to try share? Ooh, hold on. It was just starting. There we go.
Okay. All right. Cool. All right. Let's give it another go.
Give it another go.
And
If
not,
not,
I
then you play it.
Okay.
Well, there's not a flour shortage. I got the wheat in the bin out here. The mills are running. So we can't get it packaged quick enough to get it out the way the demand has flipped.
Tor Oshner says what consumers are seeing is the impact of a changing supply chain. Farmer ground flour normally sells wholesale to bakeries and food co-ops. Now, it has lost many of those orders, but demand from individual consumers and supermarkets is higher than ever. And that means changing how the flour is packaged.
For the first 3 weeks of the whole COVID-19 thing, we got more orders for 2-pound cases than we get normally in almost a year. So it's just this exponential explosion in these 2-pound bags.
The wheat from Tor's farm is milled just a few miles down the road, at the mill he co-owns.
Our mill is set up to pretty efficiently fill 25 and 50-pound bags going wholesale to bakeries. We are not super well set up to do 2-pound bags. I mean, we can do them, but not at this quantity.
Since the flour is packaged manually, it's more time-consuming to fill smaller bags. The mill is operating 18 hours a day to keep up, but even getting enough bags to meet the demand has been difficult.
We completely ran through our supply. We have these really slick little nice 2-pound bags with our name on it, a little bit about the mill. And now getting more 2-pound bags is the challenge right now.
The packaging challenges may explain why some consumers are seeing flour sold in unmarked bags or large quantities. Tor says he's been able to adapt to the changes more quickly because his company is small.
Small local suppliers are a little bit more nimble and able to react than a huge factory is able to react.
But he doesn't yet know if the new demand will be enough to make up for the orders he's lost.
I think at this point, everybody at the mill is so hunkered down trying to fill these orders that nobody exactly knows how this is shaking out financially, just because it's seriously all hands on deck to try to get, even come close to filling these orders.
Across the country in Washington, Shepherd's Grain has seen an increase in online orders for 5-pound bags of flour.
We went from 8 to 10 orders a day to we've had days where you had 120 or 130 orders, and it's 2 5-pound bags in a box.
But for Shepherd's Grain, the increase in online orders hasn't been enough to make up for the lost profits from wholesale orders. And Mark Swenson predicts a darker future.
I have every indication that we're going to lose 30 to 40% of the restaurants and bakeries when we come out of this that are not going to reopen.
While the future remains uncertain, both flour producers think home baking is a trend that might stick around.
I do think people are going to continue to have an elevated level of baking at home.
This could be a new love affair. I heard a story on NPR this morning about the milkman coming back. Some of these things that we used to do maybe will become part of our culture again, the same way maybe social distancing will be part of what we do, and maybe making bread at home, once people get a real taste for how great it is. I guess I'm hoping for that.
So again, it's a quick little 5-minute video. It's nothing crazy. It took me, 10 minutes maybe to make the worksheet that went with it. And again, it's just asking kids to pay attention to things that they normally would ignore, right? So did the coronavirus pandemic cause a flour shortage? So that's just sort of like are you paying attention? Do you understand what the word shortage means? Because some of them may not inherently just know the word shortage, and you might have to explain it. Then how has the demand for flour changed? And so illustrate the changes. That's where I would do another graph, right? You would have your supply and demand. And so the demand is increasing, which in some ways could cause that price to fall, but the quantity to go up. But again, this one's a little unique because you have large bakeries and wholesalers that don't need the flour right now, and lots of people at home are, which is why we're in a strange sort of time. And sometimes it's a little difficult to predict exactly what'll happen because it's just unique, it's different. So who does this Thor Elshner normally supply flour to and in what sizes? So really just trying to get them to pull out those little bits. And what is their biggest challenge at the moment, right? And honestly, their biggest challenge was getting bags. And that's where this whole supply chain falls into place, because who in their right minds thought that getting bags was ever going to be an issue, right? Like normally you just walk into the grocery store and there's nice little paper lunch bags for us, or they've got these suppliers that supply them all the time. But if they're having shortages because they can't get the resources they need to make bags, or they can't get workers, then it's this chain reaction. And so something important to sort of bring their attention to. Then you have another company who he's getting lots of order, it seems like, but again, his wholesale orders are down significantly. And lastly, Swenson's predicting that 30 to 40% of restaurants and bakeries will close. And when you look at the amount of failure that you already have in the restaurant industry, right? I think it's somewhere between 50 and 75% of restaurants fail within their first 5 years of opening. So imagine now that you're not in a normal time and you're in COVID land, if you want to call it that, and all of a sudden it's that much harder for you to survive as an independent restaurant or bakery who may have just gotten started. And so, for instance, there's a bakery that literally just opened up down the block. Have you been to Katie Rose Bakery yet? It's like right near the police station in Hopewell. And this poor girl opened up about 6 months ago, and now all of a sudden this hits. but she is still open because she is a food, product, but probably less people going by. The daycare is closed next door, so there's a huge ton of traffic that's not coming through. And so, you can discuss those things that kids might see in their own town, right? Some of them may have parents that work in the restaurant industry and, can definitely talk about that and those changes. So again, it opens up a lot of discussion when they see a video, and it gives them the inside track into things that we so rarely think about, like where our food comes from, right? And how long it takes to get to our table. So yeah, I don't know. Do you guys have any questions or comments?
I saw Melissa nodding her head. She went to John Jay. I think
Hey!
she had a business econ with Mr.
Ambron.
Ambron.
Mm-hmm.
Nice. Very cool.
And
Yeah, I
then
love
she
Katie
wrote
Rose.
that paper, and I asked them to write about their experience with econ growing up. Does anyone have questions or comments or thoughts? I have some questions.
I mean, I just maybe have a comment or a connection. I just purely through coincidence, I watched a show the other day. It's a cooking show, but they use but the premise of the show is because they teach people how to cook things that are like suffering in the marketplace or whatever because of overproduction a lot of times or underconsumption.
Mhm.
And again, coincidentally, they were talking about radishes actually, because they're like, oh, well, it's a Korean show. And they're like, oh, well, normally schools buy all these radishes to feed kids because they use all these dishes and stuff like that. And they're like, well, now we just have like thousands of tons of radishes that nobody wants. So it's funny that the milk example came up with a very similar problem.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, you see that even when we don't necessarily have a pandemic. I was actually just watching a show on Netflix. It's like Restaurants on the Edge or something, and they go around the country and around the world and try and save restaurants. And one of the ways they were trying to get this restaurant to save themselves money is to buy ugly fruits and vegetables. And I don't know if you guys have seen these companies that are making money by taking, the weird eggplant that's got like two strange things, or like zucchinis that might be marred and scarred and nobody wants to buy them, but it's a way to try and, not waste food. And right now that's more essential than ever because there's so much overproduction or inability to get the food to where it needs to go that you have to find creative ways to try and get local people to buy your products. And so actually a side note kind of going with that. So CSAs, right, your farms, your local farms that do pickups and do produce and all that have been booming, at least in our area. And again, I was listening to another Freakonomics podcast because people are like, well, I might as well help local. Why, just skip the middleman at this point and I'll go straight to the farms, which is a nice option.
Yeah, absolutely. Can I ask a question? A question here? So you teach just AP economics now, right? Is that correct?
Yes, it's been about 3 years since I taught on-level economics.
Got it. How? I mean, I know you're more beholden to a curriculum in AP economics. How much of an overlap is there versus how much more freedom do you have teaching regular Regents economics, would you say?
Oh God, there's a lot more freedom in regular economics for sure. I mean, you have the content that your district wants you to get. But there is a lot more time for current events and things that are a little more project-based. In the econ, the AP, I don't really have any time for projects until the AP exams are over. And the courses do not overlap by much, honestly. I would say, the microeconomics, the first 3 weeks is also stuff that I would teach in an on-level economics class. And then it goes completely like to left field, like with just much more in depth. And so in some ways I do miss teaching the on-level econ just because I did have more freedom and I had a lot more time to bring in, current events and things. I still try to with the AP class, but I would not spend a full 45 minutes on this. This would be a homework and then we'd talk about it for like 5-10 minutes the next day and then move on.
In terms then of preparing, like when you first started to teach AP Econ versus preparing to teach Regents Econ, where would be the first place you would go for each of them? I imagine it would be different for the two courses.
Yep. I mean, again, for both of them, I did go straight to a textbook and I started there. The AP classes, which anybody that ends up teaching AP right now is in a pretty good position because in the last year or two, they've produced binders that they've mailed out to everybody, or there's like digital online that sort of gives you a much more clear-cut understanding of like, you should be spending 5 days on this and 6 days on that. And it's something where it annoys me now because I have my own rhythm. But like if I'd started teaching and had it, I would be like, this is amazing. You know, this is great. So the AP is really trying to kind of not get people in lockstep. They're still giving you lots of freedom on how you teach it, but really trying to hone in on what needs to be taught and how long you need to emphasize it. Whereas the regular economics, you know, aside from the textbook, go to your colleagues. You know, if you end up in a district where there's more than one person teaching it, which depending on the size you might, or you might be the only one. If there are colleagues that have taught it, go to them, right? Ask for their advice, see what they've done. Usually people are more than happy to give you, you know, guidance. But really, I would just sort of start with the textbook and kind of work your way through it. You know, it's the kind of thing where because there is no Regents exam, if you don't finish everything in that first year, it's honestly not the end of the world unless your district does a district final. In which case, you'll have a lot of guidance just from asking to look at last year's final and getting an idea of what they covered. So, you know, there's a couple different ways you can go about it. But again, I mean, there's so many resources now that it can be overwhelming. But there are definitely lots of options. And being in New York, if you're somebody that teaches in New York, there is the framework just like there is for global and for US history. So that's another way to get some guidance too.
Maybe your top 3 online resources. I know we've shared a lot. If you have a top 3, I know we found like, I mean, the Crash Course, I think everyone kind of likes Crash Course. We were using the Fed, I don't know if you use the Fed economic resources, that's like a big database, but I was just wondering if you had another 1 or 2 that was like your top go-to.
So if you're talking AP or the beginning of, you know, you can use it for the other econs, but a lot of it won't matter. But Jacob Clifford, or he does like a site called ACDC Economics, is phenomenal.
I think a few of his videos have come up that I think I can't remember who showed them. I think it might have been Nicholas with his. But yeah, no, he seems very good and on the ball. He's been doing it a while. So he's
great, and he knows how to phrase things very cleanly and in a way that kids can understand. You know, economics is one of those things where there's just not a lot of good videos out there that are conceptual. So finding those gems are important. But honestly, sometimes you'll find on like CNN Money, they do like little snippets sometimes that are pretty good and easy for kids to understand. A lot of it's also just trial and error. You know, you might find somebody's really good at explaining this, but not so great at that. Khan Academy has a ton of stuff, but honestly, the guy bores me to tears. But
it's very boring. It's very boring.
It's up to you and your kids. They might like it because he does go slow and he does repeat himself over and over again. And for some kids, that's what they need. So,
cool. Any other questions that folks have? This is your chance.
Yeah, you'd mentioned Freakonomics, the podcast. I'll definitely check that out. Wondering if you have any other recommendations, like in terms of podcasts or series that you think we could check out.
Good question. So there is on Netflix, can I remember the name of it? It's like the Global Giant, something like that. It's the guy is it from Harold and Kumar? Yeah. He did a series. The only problem with that is the cursing and the sometimes inappropriate nature. So it kills me because some of his stuff is so good, but you have to be on the ball to like fast forward really quickly. And so you can't just assign it as like a blanket video to watch. So that's kind of a bummer, but he's got some pretty interesting stuff out there too that I like. Cal Penn, yes, thank you. I can never remember his name. Yeah, and it's a pretty good episode on corruption. And he actually goes to different like countries and looks at their levels of corruption. But again, you know, you just have to censor it a little bit.
Awesome, thanks.
Yeah, no problem. All right. Anything else?
That's awesome. Thank you. Any other last questions? No, this was amazing, and I'm on Netflix trying to find out what the series is. I haven't found it yet, but I will work on hunting it down. Yeah, there's quite a few. I mean, there's good stuff on Netflix, but then the one challenge, I think some of it goes away now, right? I think that's one of the challenges we have these days. Some of the good stuff.
Yeah.
Like,
Oh, maybe it's on Amazon Prime. I think it's on Prime because I can't get Netflix at school, so my brain automatically goes Netflix. But yeah, you may not be able to get
is there still a firewall against Netflix, or?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You can request to have it taken down, but if it's something you're going to show like multiple days, it's just such a pain. So Amazon, is an easier route to go. And there's a lot of like full-length feature films that you can show that have, good economic concepts and things in it. So like Moneyball is a good one. You can do not show Wolf of Wall Street. The kids will ask you over and over, just no, like just straight up, no, I don't need to see Jonah Hill's junk. Like that's your answer. I honestly couldn't even make it through the movie. I got 2 hours in and I was like, I gotta pee. Like how much is left? And I was like, 45 minutes. I can't do it. Like I just could not make it through. But
one of their short papers is on movies that they would show. They get to evaluate a movie and an eco. So I think Chris maybe has Moneyball, right? Someone has Moneyball. I can't remember.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think anyone chose Wolf of Wall Street this year. So
yeah, no. The original Wall Street from like 85 is got 1 or 2 parts you have to fast forward through, like the cocaine and the limo and the prostitute. But like honestly, most of it's pretty clean except for the F-bomb, which they've all heard and said, and just get a signature for watching a rated R film. But it's really got a lot of actual history to it. Let's see. So I'm looking in the group chat. CalPenn, yes, I believe CalPenn was actually part of Obama's economics team somewhere in there. I don't remember.
He's done a bunch of low-budget comedy movies before he was known in the Obama administration.
Yeah, well, didn't the other guy go into like medicine or something, or I don't even know.
Oh yeah, possibly. I don't know. Possibly.
Yeah.
They all had different. Yeah.
So question. So history to econ transition. It was a little rough at first, just because you are in some ways teaching math. It's like nothing too crazy. The graphing is honestly the hardest part, unless you get to the AP, in which case the hardest part is like multiplying fractions, and lots of graphing. But what I love about the economics is that once you start teaching it, you actually see how integral it is in weaving throughout history. And so it actually has made my teaching of US history better by looking at the economic trends and explaining why things are happening because of the money and because of, the economic decisions rather than necessarily, human rights choices or, things that have kind of skewed US history down the line. And actually, had I been able to, I really had found at Rutgers had a PhD for history and economics. And I was like, oh my God. But it said like you had to forsake all forms of income otherwise. And I was like, I have a house. I can't do that. So I didn't do it, but one day, once I retire, maybe.
Maybe they'll do everything online now. That's I think
Yeah, maybe.
Come on.
I'll get there. But me and online learning, it's with the Zoom, it's much better than just sitting there staring at stuff, but it's still not my favorite. I like in person.
I hear.
Let's see. What projects are your go-to for the regular econ? There's a lot of good things you can do. Budgeting is huge because people don't know how to budget. Let's start there. And just a project like, what's your dream job? Look up what the salary is going to be. Then you have them kind of brainstorm with you. What are your expenses? And inevitably they forget things like garbage bills and water payments and all that sort of stuff that as an adult, you're like, really? Like $30 a month for water? Come on now. And, so it's a good life lesson for them in still a theoretical way, but it also makes them realize like, no, you're not going to be making $200K out of college or high school. Like that's not how it goes. So that's a great one. Also, I like, I've done a Shark Tank with them before, which I've turned into, I think I did, it's probably a 3-week project, 2 or 3 weeks. I did it in groups. I had them try and create, something unique. They could use things that exist and try and, expand upon them. But I literally had them create a logo for their company. I had them look up where they were going to sell this or produce this, whether it was something that they needed a warehouse for or something they needed, a storefront for. And then I actually got other teachers in the building to sit down for their presentations and be the sharks. And some of the teachers were friendlier than others. Some of them ripped them apart and were like, why should I invest in your company? But it turned out great. And that was a nice sort of end of the year project once they really know you and know your expectations and are a little more comfortable kind of talking in front of the class. But even something I just did with my AP class could totally be used in a Regents level. I actually, with those Freakonomic podcasts, I gave them 3 choices. There was one on loneliness, one on socialism, and then one on the food chain. So that's part of why I had, so much information from Freakonomics on that. I made them listen to it and answer like 10 questions. Then I gave them 4 articles that either supported or refuted the information in the podcast. Then I had them analyze survey data, because there was lots of surveys on loneliness, on food insecurity is like the key term for people that are, don't have enough food, and various surveys just to get like data. And so we're at that stage right now. And the next bit is I'm actually going to have them create their own survey to put out on their social media and see, what people are currently experiencing. Has COVID made loneliness worse? And I was like, make it all anonymous. Like, your friends don't need to be spilling their guts to you. And so they're going to do that. And I'll actually put it out to my people too. And then the last thing is they're going to do a 5-minute video kind of recapping everything they've learned and, how it compares to what people they know are saying. So, there's a lot of really creative things you can do, especially in on-level class where you have the time. Any questions on any of those projects? I know I rattled off like a bunch to you, but.
Sure. I just had one question because as someone in this class, I think 2 years ago did a sample lesson where we did the Shark Tank thing. And the one question that he wasn't sure was like, should the projects be like very concretely doable, or can they be more like, you know what I'm saying? Like, how did you balance that? How concrete did you make it in terms of instructions?
My thing was always like, it's got to be something that is feasible with our current technology. Yeah. Like, you can't tell me you're going to create like a space-time continuum right. or something as cool as that would be, it had to be something that was foreseeable in the next couple of years that could be achieved and in like a reasonable amount of money that you don't need like Bill Gates style money to do it. Yeah. Let's see. So was there a concept that students were not grasping collectively, and how did you make it more accessible? Good question. Collectively, I mean, in an on-level class, you're going to have kids that are at different levels, right? You'll have the kids who just didn't want to take the AP for that subject. You'll have kids that, might be special ed in other classes, but are really good in social studies. So they end up in your Regents level or regular on-level economics, but they're not great with math. So that could be problematic. Honestly, though, the biggest thing in an on-level class that kids struggle with is supply and demand. That's the biggest thing. So, I normally teach it. I kind of get it out of the way at the beginning because you do need at least a general understanding for a lot of the course. But everything else in a traditional like overview or intro to econ class is pretty accessible because it's dealing with banking, which they may not know a lot about, but it's easy enough to get them to understand banking and how it works. And the Federal Reserve's actions and how it can alter the money supply. I'm trying to think. Like I said, it's been a couple of years since I've taught it, but it was really the supply and demand that most kids get hung up on.
They find the money supply stuff easier than the supply and demand. Is that right?
A lot of them do. And a big part of it is when you're explaining how banking works, visuals. Visuals and cartoons are key because the whole idea that the bank doesn't just hold on to your money for you is something that a lot of kids, even at junior and senior years, still don't get. The fact that when you deposit your money, the bank keeps a portion and then lends out the rest. And when they lent out the rest, They're literally creating new money that didn't exist before. So that's one of those topics that they also might get a little hung up on, but I draw like a little bank, and I draw a little person, and then I draw another little person, and I show the money kind of transitioning from one to the next. And usually after that, they're like, oh, okay, I get it. Because I can still go back to the bank and get my $100 I deposited, but Joe still has the 90 that the bank lent him. So all of a sudden, instead of just $100, there's 190. And they're kind of like, okay, that makes sense now. So, whenever you can illustrate or find goofy little cartoons, is good.
I just have a comment really quick.
Yeah.
But going back to your lesson before, my sister works for Organic Valley, so she's told me like a lot about all this milk production throughout coronavirus. And she was actually saying that since they had the shortage for selling to schools and stadiums and restaurants and stuff like that, their demand in the grocery store was so high for their brand that they actually ended up they didn't make as much chocolate milk anymore, and they were taking that milk and using it for regular white milk containers to continue to send to grocery stores, so they didn't lose that supply.
Wow, that's great. And you know what? Probably a lot of that is because they're probably a smaller company, right? If they're an organic, they're probably tinier. And like he was saying in that flour video, where it was easier for him to transition because of that, it's probably something similar, because these groceries are reaching out to small companies they know can easily just change their shipping and get it to them. That's cool. Chocolate milk down the door.
I think that was the most fascinating, like practical change I noticed, is like how many businesses like rework the way they do things, right? Companies that didn't do deliveries before now are, right? Like all those food places, you can get toilet paper, and it's like get takeout, and we'll throw in a thing of toilet, right? Like, so like the way that like capitalism restructures itself to meet demands as demand change, I think was,
Absolutely. And so on that note of, the smaller companies, so I don't know how many of you, I guess Melissa would know, Adams Fairacre Farms is like a local grocer by us. So some of you are shaking your heads too. It's similar to like a Trader Joe's, but like
a more farmy version of DiCicco's or Gigios.
Yes.
It's like less Italian, more kind of farm stand, but it's like the same sort of size. Okay.
Yes. So they actually, I have a really good friend that's a manager there, and they have been crushing it since this whole thing. And a big part of it is because when your larger stores like ShopRite couldn't get meat because they don't truly have butchers in ShopRite. Like, there's people that can like grind beef up and put it in a package, but they don't have true butchers. So they rely on the big processing plants for all of their meat. Whereas this local Adams and probably DiCicco's and whoever has actual butchers, they had meat when BJ's didn't and ShopRite didn't, because their supply chain is different, because they can literally get a cow and then turn it into their product, and they don't have to change their way of restructuring things because they're already doing it. And so when I couldn't find, zucchini there, I went to, at ShopRite, I went to Adams, and boom, there was zucchini, because those smaller companies have local connections, and it's a lot easier for them in these situations, believe it or not. Whereas I would have thought the large stores would have had, more access. It turns out that's not the case. So it's very interesting, how things sort of shifted our perception of production and supply.
No, I think that's true. Exactly. Yeah, I thought that as well. Like that like you'd see the small, you would be your Walmarts and your big companies that would do that. But in fact, it was just the opposite, right? There was that Barton Orchards, like they even increased their offerings, right? And I'm like, that's so. Yeah. It certainly, there were things that happened that were counter to my expectations with a lot.
I know even Fishkill Farms early on was like a wash in eggs, and then I went on maybe 3 weeks ago. I was like, oh, let me like go get some eggs. It was $8 a carton, and I'm like,
yeah. Right.
No.
Yeah, and then of course the way things fluctuate, right? And then it kind of normalizes, and it's interesting to see that. I mean, the whole thing has been crazy and sad, but from an economic perspective, it is interesting to see how things move. And meat prices went up right after they talked about the meat shortage. You start to see prices creep up, and it is just and the flour one was pretty fascinating too. And I think what was the big one? Yeast. Yeast was like a month ago. Everyone was like hoarding yeast, like. I remember on like a Zoom call, someone's like, "Well, I've got a big thing of yeast. Like, I'll send you a packet." Right? It was like,
I know. Well, I started baking bread, like Heather was saying in there. I was like, you know what? One of my seniors last year gave me her starter. She's like, my mom's going to kill it. You want it? I'm like, sure. I hadn't touched the damn thing except to keep it alive. And then I was like, well, I guess I'm making bread, like, let's do it.
Yeah, no, it is,
Yeah.
it's fascinating in that way. It's
Mm-hmm.
like there's demand for different products at different times, right? So like,
Mm-hmm.
the haircut implements like around week 4 or 5, like that became a thing. And
Mm-hmm. Exercise equipment, you can't find a kettlebell to save your life unless you want to pay like $100 for a 10-pound weight. Like, it's crazy.
Yeah. So yeah, it's weird how it's demand for some things dropped and some things increase, and yeah, it's cool.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. The only other one question I had was, I certainly felt like when I was teaching the last course online, like there was a point where I'm like, I don't really want to talk about COVID just yet. It's too soon. Did you find a similar thing with your students, or are they, because they're younger and maybe a little, they're I mean, I feel like high schoolers are always invincible, or they feel like they are. Did you feel like you kind of had to jump into it sooner just because of what they were asking?
So I'm a weirdo, and I had started talking about this in like December, and I was like,
yeah,
just you wait, like it's coming, children. So I actually had been kind of prepping my kids pretty early on, like with the first cases popping up in China, especially because in like a very unique sort of way, I had knowledge of what was going on over in the schools there before it was necessarily being reported on here, because I'm on an AP chat on Facebook with like teachers that teach the AP economics around the world. And the teachers there, like as soon as they were shutting them down for a month, were on the chat. Like, what do I do? How do I convert to teaching this online when it's such a tricky course to sometimes teach in person? And so I had been bringing up to my kids, I was like, FYI, Korea just shut down for a month. Japan just shut. So I had already been sort of talking with them about it, and my administration probably was ready to kill me, but I'm like, look, I'm not going to lie to them. And, I was a big proponent of sort of like, just be safe, wash your hands, but remember, you've got elderly people that you love. So, it is still something to think about. So for me, the transition really wasn't bad because I had already sort of been discussing it with them ahead of time. But certainly the transition as a whole was just tricky because I don't really use Google Classroom on the norm. To me, it's in some ways cumbersome and not necessary. I'll probably be using it more down the line just because of, how familiar I've become with it. And just in case we do next year, not start the year in person, or we start the year in person and have to go out, and just to get the kids into it. But honestly, I think the kids weren't as freaked out because I'd been talking about it.
That makes sense. And then the only other thing is, in terms of how you do your teaching, with grad classes, we've mostly been doing Zoom. What was the balance between like students do work on their own, projects on their own, versus like pre-recorded videos that you gave them or you made versus the in-person stuff? What was your breakdown? And do you think that was what most other teachers did, or was everyone kind of all over the place?
All over the place.
Yeah.
My district did not give specific protocol on whether or not we had to do synchronous learning versus asynchronous. And so they sort of left it up to us, whereas other districts like Spack and Kill, I know they had to meet 2 or 3 times a week face-to-face with their classes. I really, for my Regents US, did maybe an every other week Google Hangout just to check in. I actually did Kahoots, which if you guys have never played a Kahoot review game, it's great to play with kids, and you can actually do it online really easily. Just share your screen, and then they.
We play Kahoot. We're experts at Kahoots. That's one thing.
Good. So honestly, that was my check-in with them. Was sort of like, hey, show up, and we're going to play a review game, and then I'm going to let you go. But I would say I did about 50% like articles with questions, 50% videos. And within the videos, I would say half of those were me doing a PowerPoint and half were like an actual video from YouTube kind of a thing. So, the only problem with articles is kids are just copying and pasting, unless you then ask, questions for them to expand upon and put their own personal stuff in there. But yet I don't want to not give them anything to read because they still need to read. Like, even if they're copying and pasting the answers, at least they read it first to know it's the answer, you know? So that was kind of my process with the AP kids. It was a lot of, I'm going to do like just how I did the drawing on the whiteboard. I'm going to do a lesson and then here's some practice problems. And so I would do a lot of that. And then I would hold almost daily office hours. And usually I'd get one, maybe two kids popping in. And then maybe every 2 weeks, again, I'd do like a required pop in.
Would you use Screencastify to do your recordings?
I used a mixture of Screencastify, or actually the Google Meet has a pretty decent record feature. So either one.
Cool. Does that upload them as YouTube videos? I use Google Classroom nearly as much.
You can, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, cool. Awesome. Yeah. Thank you so much. Does anyone have any last questions? Were there particular? Were there any? One of those, Xanas, was there any particular difficulties or issues with podcast-based projects due to the format length of the podcast themselves? Do you mean of like the students just being able to watch something so long, or?
Yeah, like if you assign like a Freakonomics podcast that's 45 minutes long or whatever. I was just wondering because I feel like I listen to a ton of podcasts as an adult because it's just like a natural thing as I'm driving or whatever. But if I was 17, I don't sitting for 45 minutes and like trying to like listen to a podcast and do work, but also it doesn't take all my attention, so I need to do something else. I was wondering about that.
Yeah. You know, at this point, I've really only done the podcast with my AP kids. And so the biggest thing is just give them enough days to work on it, you know, because for a lot of them, they probably really only have a 15-minute time span that they can handle listening to a podcast and actually paying attention to it. So if you give them, you know, 2 days to do it over, 3 days to do it over, that's good enough for them to be able to get through it. And I would say even for on level, that's plenty of time for them to be able to do that. The AP kids, honestly, I think most of them probably just chugged through the whole 45 minutes and you know, banged it out. So, you know, you're going to find that difficulty with almost anything you give high schoolers because their attention is so pulled. I mean, all of us, right? I mean, my phone blew up, I don't even know how many times during this class, and I'm able to just shove it away, whereas, you know, kids are not. They're going to be checking it. And so as long as you give just enough days for them to get the work done, they'll make it happen somehow, you know?
Yeah, that's a great point. Cool. Well, thank you. Is there any other last? Well, thank you so much. We really appreciate it. I think everyone learned a lot. I'll give my claps or my applause. I appreciate it. And yes, there's lots of virtual applause there. And yeah, no, it was great to really just hear about your teaching AP economics and econ, and then also the challenges of this semester, which we all kind of faced headlong together. So it was good to kind of catch up with you. And yeah, so I think everyone here is going to be doing student teaching within a year, right? I think that's right.
All right, nice.
Fall or next spring, I think. So, you know, they'll be in the classroom, you know, soon. And yeah, any other last advice for them for being teachers or getting a teaching job, anything like that?
Go easy on yourself.
Yeah.
It is hard and it will be stressful, but you can do it. And you just have to give yourself permission to screw up because it's going to happen. Honestly, that's the best learning tool when student teaching, and nobody likes it and it's not comfortable and it may be awkward, but that's how you grow, right? And so, you know, do your best to prepare yourself so that you have enough material in any one given day, right? Because the more time that you fill in that class with good content and valuable content, the less likely things are to go wrong, right? So don't ever go in and be like, I'm just going to wing it. Like, that's never the way to succeed, right? So you always want to have too much prepared, and if it rolls into tomorrow, that's okay.
Perfect.
So
you made it through today then in that case. You had enough. You had enough that you made it through to the next day and you're good,
yeah.
Right? So yeah.
Yep, absolutely.
No,
so
good.
Anytime you guys have questions, you know, send them through your teacher and I'll gladly answer them.
Yep.
All right.
Absolutely. Well, we appreciate it. Thanks again. And we have a short commute home today, which is nice. So we still have class. We usually go to about 9. So we have our short papers we're going to discuss. They're going to talk about their own economics education, what they thought was lacking, what they thought was good, and then what they would do in their own teaching that would be cool. So we're going to discuss that.
Nice. Well, I'd love to hear that feedback later.
Yeah, cool.
Good luck, everybody.
All right. Take care. Thank you again, Alyson. Cool. So hopefully that was good. I think it was a good experience. You got a real teacher to hear from, and econ teacher. And I think what's really great about her perspective is that, right, she was a history major, just like many of you. How many of you were history majors as undergrads? I'm just curious. Almost everyone. Who wasn't? Was Elias? I think was business, right? Or you, Christina?
I was communications.
Cool. Communications. Melissa?
I was business as well, John.
Business. Cool. Your business as well. Melissa?
Early childhood ed and behavioral science.
Cool. Awesome. Cool. And then I think Liz was like global studies or something like that, right?
Yep. You got it.
And Nick, what did you study? History?
I was history in undergrad.
Okay. Cool. Awesome. Yeah. So, I mean, I think it kind of shows you that you could be a history major and end up teaching econ. And I think at one point she said, like, I actually feel like I'm better at certain aspects of U.S. history now that I know econ more. And I didn't ask her too much in depth on that, but absolutely, like stuff like the Cross of Gold speech or like the Great Depression, the 1930s, a lot of those banking crisis. I think, but without the economic perspective, you're like, wait, what the heck is this all about? And I think to really ground it makes you better as a teacher. And then I think for Chris and for Elias, I know I wrote Elias this in your paper, definitely when you go to interviews, of course, if it's like a world history class, I think bring your background in business to the fore, right? Like the way that you can do like, hey, personal finance is an important part of social studies. You may want to throw that in there, right? So definitely pump your assets up, right? So if you're a history major, that's great. If you can do clubs, if you can do sports, if you have a different major that can be like an additional bonus, right, in terms of your teaching career, make sure you present that to the hiring committee, right? I think they're always looking for people who have a diversity of experiences and, might be able to do a club or to do an extra